Well, we want to talk about Swaziland, and with the new name, that he has given the country his name. Of course, the name Swaziland came from, I think, his grandfather, you know.
Mhm.
And so after he had his last birthday, if the people like this, it's fine. But this question of absolute monarchy is a
Yes.
very negative phenomenon. So let me go over the history. I just want to read the history of this people
Thank you.
and how we arrived at this place. And then we can talk about what's happening now in
Mm.
the country. So the history goes back. And according to the tradition, the people of the present Swazi nation migrated south before the 16th century to what is now Mozambique. Following a series of conflicts, though, with the people in the area of modern Maputo, the Swazi settled in northern Zululand in about 1750. Unable to match the growing Zulu strength, the Swazi moved gradually northward in the 1800s. So they're new to this land in the 1800s and established themselves in the area of what now is the present day Swaziland. And then they began to claim territory. They consolidated their hold under several able leaders. The most important was Mswati II, from whom the Swazis derived their name. Under his leadership in the 1840s, the Swazis expanded their territory to the northwest and stabilized the southern frontier with the Zulu. And they were able to stabilize the southern frontier with the Zulus because they made a pact with the British so that the British would bring the British army in on the side of the Swazis against the Zulus, who the British was at war with. And as we study and learn about the great Zulu wars under Bambata and under so many of the other great leaders, that Sechuweya, that fought with the Zulu nation. Well, this was all happening at the same time. And so the Swazis reached out and made an alliance with the British to help them fight the Zulus in order to consolidate the land they currently have. So the contact with the British came early in Swazi's region when the king asked the British authorities in South Africa for assistance against the Zulu raids into Swaziland. It also was during in Swazi's reign that the first whites settled in the country. Following Swazi's death, the Swazis reached an agreement with the British and South African authorities over a range of issues. One of the biggest was the gold mine. Swaziland had a major gold deposit, much of which the British have taken out and stored in their country to date. So the British and the South African authorities over a range of issues they discussed, including independence, claims on resources, meaning who would own the resources in the ground, the talcum, the gold, the diamonds, and now they've even struck oil. And so Swazi is considered to be one of the richest countries in the world. So why is 63% of your people living in poverty? That's the big question, and
Absolutely.
that's the big problem today. So the South African administered Swazi's interest from 1894 to 1902. The white South Africans controlled the country administratively from 1894 to 1902. In 1902, the British assumed control of the administration of the country. Yes, the king was the king, but the British ran all of its international trade agreements, etc. In 1921, after more than 20 years of rule by Queen Regent Lebathabini, the head of Swazi nation, that same year Swaziland established the first legislative body. And listen to this now, the legislative body that was established in 1921 was an advisory council of elected European representatives mandated to advise the British High Commission on non-Swazi affairs. In 1944, this High Commission conceded that the council had no official status and recognized the paramount chief, of the man we call king, as the native authority for the territory to issue legally enforceable orders to the Swazi. So we've taken all your wealth that we want, so now we're going to let you manage your people as long as you keep them in check. The same situation we're seeing in South Africa today. So there was, at some point, they were worried about apartheid. So in the early years of colonial rule, this was the British being the colonizer of Swaziland, which is a landlocked country in the middle of South Africa. And so the British had expected that Swaziland would eventually be incorporated into South Africa. But after World War II, however, South Africa's intensification of apartheid and racial discrimination induced the British Kingdom to prepare Swaziland for independence. They weren't worried about racism. They wanted the gold and diamond of Swaziland for Britain, and that was South Africa. So the British helped them fight for independence. So the political activities intensified in the years of early 1960. Several political parties were formed, adjusting for independence and economic development in the country. So preparing for independence in Swaziland, the largely urban parties had few ties to the rural areas where the majority of the Swazis live. Now, Swazi people is about 1.3 million people that lives in the country, with about 70% living in the rural area of the country, even today. The traditional Swazi leaders, including King Sabhuza II and his inner council, formed the Imbokobo, the national movement, and grouping in a group that capitalized on a close identification with the Swazi way of life. And responding to pressure for political change, the colonial government, meaning the British, scheduled an election in mid-1964 for the first legislative council in which the Swazi would participate. In the election, this new party, which the British backed with the monarch, this is not a traditional African monarch. This is a monarchy created by the British, okay? They may have tried to maintain the trappings of the traditional African monarch, and I'll speak on that later, but this is the British imposed monarch, which was an absolute monarchy where the people had no say, no right, and even with the legislative council, the monarchy could cancel or veto or dissolve anything he wanted without any counseling from his people. So in the election, this INM party and four other parties, most having more radical platforms, ran the election. Of course, the INP won the election because the British was running the election. These are the British people. They did incorporate, however, some of the things from the other party. So initially, they talked about having a constitutional monarchy, which is not that bad when you think of constitutional monarchy. And I was actually looking at some of the definition. But what a constitutional monarchy means is that the monarch don't have absolute power, that there's a legislative council of the people and there's a constitution which the monarch is obliged to follow. But what's happening in Swaziland today is not a constitutional monarch, which was voted in 1964. What you have today is an absolute monarch where the king can veto everything. So in 1966, Britain agreed to discuss a new constitution. Now this is Britain discussing our constitution. A constitutional committee agreed on a constitutional monarch for Swaziland. But today we're not dealing with a constitutional monarch, you deal with an absolute monarch. And I'll give the definition of constitutional monarch in a minute. So with self-government to follow parliamentary elections in 1967 and 68, which never happened. So this king, Bosiso, declared himself in 1968's constitution. On April 12, 1973, though, the king declared himself an absolute monarch, even though the people voted in 1964 for a constitutional monarch. And he dissolved parliament. He assumed all powers of government and prohibited all political activities and trade unions from operating. He justified his actions as having removed alien and divisive political practice, talking about the Marxists and the socialists that some of the other parties lean towards, with the Swazi way of life. And the Swazi way of life was migrants who came from central, maybe the Congo region or the Kenyan region, down to this area in the 16th and early 1700s. And so the king, when he died in August 1982, and the Queen Zulu assumed the duties of the head of state, in 1984, an internal dispute led to the replacement of the prime minister and eventually replaced Nzululi by a new queen regent, Ntumbi. Ntumbi's only child, Prince Makhosetive, was named the heir to the Swazi throne. So now they've created a family monarchy out of having been appointed to power by the British. That's not an African hereditary monarchy that comes from the choice of the people, which usually give that role to a particular family who were the founding leader of their community and who was willing to live by the code of conduct, the protocols of that community around things ethical and moral and in service of the people. That's not what happens here. So he was named the heir to the Swazi throne in 1984, and an advisory body, and then he went forward, and the real power at this time was centered in Lekogo, a supreme traditional advisory body that claimed to give binding advice to the Queen. In October 1985, Queen Ntumbi demonstrated her power by dismissing the leading figures of the very body, the Legogo, that gave her the advice. So again, we're back to this absolute monarch where there's no one that can advise or direct or instruct that person. And that person is rooted in a family and is in control of all of the wealth of the nation and is the one that is the last signatory on all the documents concerning trade and the sale of raw materials out of the land of this nation. So they've been a call for democracy. So this Prince Makhosetive, the son of the Queen, returned from school in England, of course, to ascend to the throne and help end the continual internal disputes. He was enthroned as Mswati III on April 25th, 1986. Shortly afterwards, he abolished the Legogo, the Supreme Council that would advise him. In November 1987, a new parliament was elected and a new cabinet appointed. In 1988 and 89, an underground political party, the People's United Democratic Movement, criticized the king and his government, calling for democratic reforms. In response to this political threat and to the growing popular calls for greater accountability within government, the king and the prime minister initiated an ongoing national debate on the constitution and political future of Swaziland. This debate produced a handful of political reforms approved by the king, including a direct and indirect voting in the 1993 national elections. But that doesn't mean very much, and I'll show you in a minute. And although domestic groups and international observers criticized the government in the late 2002 election for interfering with the independence of the judiciary and the parliament and freedom of the press, significant improvements have been made in the country. In addition, the new constitution went into effect in early 2006, and the 1973 proclamation, which among others measured banned political parties, lapsed at that time. The king had imposed that ban on all political parties. And here's what makes the whole thing very weak and give this monarchy absolutely control. On September 21st this year, they'll have elections again, and over 500,000 registered voters in the country, formerly known as Swaziland, will elect 55 parliamentarians to the House of Assembly. Now here's where the problem comes in. King Mswati III, Mswati's powerful monarch, will appoint the remaining 10 to make the lower house of 65 representatives. Well, that's not too bad because he only gets to appoint 10 and the people elect 55. But then listen to this. The elected MPs will then choose 10 senators for the upper house where the main decisions are made, while the king will select 20 for the upper house. This means he has twice the control. So with a wide range of power, allowing the kings to summon and dissolve Parliament anytime he wants, there is no real Parliament in the country, except it served as his behest. And so that is the root of the problem today. People want a real participatory democracy where the people have a say. 63% of the people in Swaziland live in poverty. So how do you rationalize, as the monarch, buying 10 or 12 or 15 Rolls Royce for your wives? You have your 15 wives, and they're living in total luxury, able to travel anywhere in the world with you or without you, while 63% of your people live in poverty. And the strange thing, the arable land in that country is only 10.17% of the land that's used for agriculture. And it only produced about 8.2% of the GDP of the nation. Yet, 70% of the labor force work that land. Okay? Now, even, the forests, they have about 33% of forests covering their land. And forest and timber is a major industry there. Diamond is still a major industry. Even though the diamond and the gold combined, they say now only account for 3% of the GDP. I'm sure that's what we see declared, And so they have talcum, they have other minerals that makes up the wealth of the nation. So despite the World Bank and International Monetary Fund devaluing the dollar or the currency, Swaziland is still considered to be one of the wealthiest nations in the world compared to its size, population, and the amount of wealth and raw material in its grounds. So why are your people suffering in poverty? And that's the question. This false notion of an African traditional monarchy is a lie, because this monarchy is established on peripheral fragments of traditional monarchy, but established by the British as an instrument that allowed them to rule and rob that land for more than a century without the people having anything to say. And then you have a pimp pretending to be the leader, calling himself the king or the monarch or whatever. He can enjoy all the benefits of the wealth, him and his prime ministers and his cabinets and their family, while the masses of your 1.3 million people, 63 to 65% of them are suffering. And so why are the people in the streets burning things down and burning down the property that the king owned? Why does the king even own properties and businesses in a country? So all of these are some of the sad reasons why a nation that has the resources to model itself after a Rwanda is much smaller than Rwanda. Yet it has more wealth than Rwanda. Yet Rwanda puts it to shame in terms of what Rwanda is able to deliver for her people out of the resources of the nation. And in recent times, they have had petroleum strikes in the nation, and they've set a petroleum board. But that is all controlled by the same king and his family and friends. But whatever wealth comes from that petroleum will not go to the masses of the people of Swaziland. And that's why the people are fighting. The young people have no jobs. Young people have no future. If you can't afford to feed a family, feed your wife, and feed your children, and own a house, and provide medical care, what are you going to do? Migrate to another country and sell knockoff Chinese goods by the road, like we see in too many places in Africa? Well, you come from a nation that has extraordinary wealth. Only a handful of people with ties to Europe is profiting from that wealth. And this is the classical model we're seeing in Swaziland today.
You are watching the Pan-African Daily TV with Dr. Susan Tata. The Africa we want: unity, consciousness, our culture, our spirituality, our history. One Africa for Africans worldwide. Motherland's calling its diaspora home. Join my voice. Join my team. Join my campaign. Campaign 21 hashtag 1 million subscribers on the Pan-African Daily TV YouTube. Be a volunteer. Apply now. Be the new Africa.